Well, thank you. It's really very nice to be here. So I appreciate the invitation, and it's a great honor as well. I will talk about, as befits an economist, the trade-offs that globalization creates, and how to think about those trade-offs in terms of both democratic accountability and the scope of the nation state. But let me begin by noting that it is not a surprise from the vantage point of either economic theory or economic history that we are seeing a backlash that takes the form of populism at the same time that we are experiencing a very advanced stage of globalization, which I will call hyperglobalization, and I'll be clearer about what I mean by hyperglobalization in a couple of minutes. In fact, historically, the very first self-consciously populist political movement also developed largely as a reaction to globalization. I have in mind the late 19th century populist movement in the United States called the People's Party. And the People's Party represented at the time those who viewed themselves as the losers of the globalization at that time. Of course, the globalization of that time was the gold standard. And farmers who were facing, on the one hand, declining world prices for their commodities, on the other hand, due to a scarcity of gold, relatively high interest rates, and therefore feeling that they were being crushed under a heavy debt burden, targeted the gold standard as the reason for their difficulties. And so this clash between having to live by the rules of the world economy and the dislocations that sometimes, and the social strains that sometimes, and in fact often creates domestically, is a theme that goes quite a way back, and I will want to develop this. I'll do this in the context of the title of my presentation, which is a construct that I've called the political trilemma of the global economy. I think it highlights these trade-offs that I mentioned at the outset. But I want to build to the trilemma in a number of steps. And so, let me do that. The presentation is on the screen, so some of it, I think, especially when I get to the trilemma, you may want to follow it on the screen, because I think visually it works better than when I try to put it in words. But I'm going to actually skip the first, three slides in the interest of time. And the first step of the argument is to say something that is not going to be particularly surprising to anybody in this room, but is something that sometimes economists have to remind themselves of, which is that markets, of course, globalization is about the global expansion of markets, so markets are a key element in this construct. Markets are not self-standing, independently enacted social arrangements that they rely on, or what one might call, in using the term that goes back to Karl Polanyi, that their markets are embedded in a range of institutions. At least four types of institutions. One are market-creating institutions, and without basic property rights, basic institutions of contract enforcement, and indeed without a modicum of social trust, you cannot have certainly long-distance markets exist. So we have one category of institutions that enable markets to exist. We have a second set of institutions that are necessary to regulate markets, because markets are not self-regulating. In an advanced economy, those domains of regulation are well known. Competition policy or antitrust, financial regulation, the promotion of research and development, environmental regulations, consumer safety and protection. These regulatory institutions exist because in the absence of such market regulating institutions, markets can be prone to what economists call market failure. In other words, not produce the alleged benefits that markets are supposed to produce. Third, markets are not self-stabilizing, that they are given to cycles. And ever since Keynes, we know that you need stabilizing institutions in terms of monetary and fiscal policies. And fourth, I think as important, maybe perhaps more important than the other three, is that markets are not self-legitimizing, that you need other institutions to ensure that the distributive outcomes that markets produce are legitimized through non-market institutions. Again, in the advanced countries, those market legitimizing institutions take the form of the provision of social insurance, tax and transfer redistribution schemes, and ultimately, of course, in the evolution of capitalism, political democracy has been the most important legitimizing institution for market capitalism. That it's essentially by embedding these the design of these regulatory institutions under broad accountability, it has been extremely important to ensure the sustainability of market capitalism. So point number one, very basic, is that markets need a very extensive range of institutions in order to function well. And I've summarized them under those four headings. The second building block in my argument is that those institutions in which markets are embedded do not take a single universal form, that there is significant diversity possible in the design of those institutions. That is, market supporting institutions are not unique. One way of saying that is to say that the mapping from the institutional requirements, such as the need to regulate or the need to create markets or need to stabilize markets, that these functions do not map into institutional designs or institutional forms that are unique. So these market supporting institutions can take an almost infinite variety of forms in principle. And the diversity that we do see in the world, which presumably is only a narrow subset of the plausible diversity that we could have, is grounded in a number of different historical contingencies. One is that nations may have quite different preferences, social preferences, over some basic trade-offs, and the institutional choices they make will be reflected, therefore, in rather different institutions. So, for example, nations might select a different point on a kind of trade-off, let's say, between equity versus opportunity that might reflect themselves in different kinds of institutions. It is often said that the United States typically has put much higher weight on opportunity than on equity, and therefore that creates a kind of a more, a less regulated form of market capitalism than what we've had in Europe. Similarly, with respect to financial regulation, there's a choice to be made as to how do we trade off financial innovation against financial stability. The more innovation we want, the less stability we have to accept. Again, nations might make different choices over that and therefore come up with different regulatory designs. The second has to do the second reason for the difference, the observed difference across countries in these institutional arrangements, has to do with the complementarity in different types of institutional arrangements. So if you have a country that traditionally, like Japan, for example, that has provided social insurance, not through extensive welfare state arrangements, but largely through regulation of product or service markets, and it's going to be difficult to deregulate those product and service markets without at the same time redesigning the welfare state or reinstituting a welfare state at the same time. So these different clusters of self-supporting institutions make it difficult for countries to change their institutional arrangements marginally and potentially converge to a single set of institutional arrangements. And third, very importantly, the desirability of different kinds of institutional arrangements depend on availability of resources and the level of development of different countries. So a very old argument that goes all the way back to Alexander Gerschenkron is that countries that are converging or developing tend to develop much different set of institutions in the areas of banking or industrial regulation than countries that are already at the frontier of development. And we can expand all these reasons why countries might choose to make choices over their institutional possibilities, and that will create differences in institutional choices. Okay, that second part of the building block, again, in principle, should not be controversial. The third argument, the third building block in the argument is that there is a tension between what I've called hyperglobalization and existing institutional diversity. So to explain why there is a tension between hyperglobalization and institutional diversity across countries, let me be very clear about what I mean by hyperglobalization. By hyperglobalization, I'm referring to essentially a market that is as integrated across borders as it is within nations. This would be a model of full economic integration and the total absence of transaction costs on cross-border commercial and financial relations associated with the borders. So a world market or a regional market that is as integrated, as seamless, as much of a single market as a domestic market is. Now, when you think about what that implies for policies of the states, there are three types of requirements at increasing levels of demanding. One, and most obviously, states cannot impose restrictions at the border on goods, services, and flows of capital, obviously. The second, more demanding requirement is that you must also harmonize monetary, legal, and regulatory regimes so that the differences in these regimes, whether it's differences in money, differences in regulation, do not act as transactions costs that arise from these jurisdictional discontinuities associated with the presence of nation states. And that, of course, is why the whole point about the single market in the context of the European Union, and moreover in the context of the currency area, the elimination of transactions costs associated with different monies. Third, and again, that's well understood in the context of what is the part of the world where we come actually closest to existing hyperglobalization, that's the Eurozone. Countries must credibly pre-commit to not deviating from these harmonized regimes. So it's not enough simply to peg your exchange rate to the exchange rate of other countries so that there won't be any transactions costs associated with different exchange rates or changes in exchange rate. You must credibly commit to never move your exchange rate, which is why ultimately European exchange rate mechanism ended up where it did, which was the single currency, which was the only way you could credibly commit to not changing your exchange rate was to eliminate exchange rates altogether and to move to a single money. So when countries, therefore, do make choices on the second and third of these elements, namely with respect to their monetary, regulatory, and legal regimes that are diverse and therefore do create jurisdictional discontinuities, and they do not make credible pre-commitments, either because they do not want to, they want to maintain these differences, or because they're unable to, then there is going to be necessarily that these differences in national institutional arrangements are going to create cross-border transactions cost. Again, it's a point that the whole point of the Eurozone has been precisely to overcome these transactions costs. Furthermore, it's not just that the differences in institutional arrangements create transactions costs. In fact, maintaining differences in national institutions requires the presence of cross-border transactions costs, because in the absence of those transactions costs, you might not be able to maintain your own institutions. That's because of the principle of, or the logic of arbitrage. That is that if countries in the limit, and where we see this very clearly is, for example, in the area of corporate taxation, that is that if you have low tax jurisdictions, there will be a tendency for capital to move, not necessarily physically, but to the establishment of paper companies, to areas where the tax rates are low. So the principle of buy cheap, sell dear, which is what the principle of arbitrage is, will tend to undermine institutional arrangements where they seem to impose greater cost of a particular type on segments or on certain patterns of, on certain types of markets. And I think that kind of arbitrage, the logic of hyperglobalization, will tend to undermine differences in regulations and social models unless they are blocked. And that's why the logic of institutional diversity requires the presence of cross-border transactions cost. Again, this is an issue that European countries face almost on a day-to-day basis. In a lot of areas, they have, as I was suggesting before, have gone with the principle of hyperglobalization and therefore convergence of regulatory areas. In some other areas, they have actually deliberately introduced barriers to hyperglobalization. For example, the most recent such decision that I know of is the case of posted workers, where it was made more difficult for, let's say, French companies to hire temporary workers from Poland without actually having those workers satisfy French labor laws as opposed to the countries where they're coming from, Poland, which would have been the sort of the hyper-globalist model. That is that every, essentially, you can export goods and services, including, in this case, labor services, according to how you want, but then there's not going to be any imposition of how those services, what kind of standards they have to satisfy in the country that they enter. That was one case, in fact, where the European single market went against the principle of hyper-globalization. So, in general, I think the tension between hyper-globalization and institutional diversity can remain manageable when either economic integration is limited or the regulatory differences tend to be small. So we see this in the US federal case, where, in fact, there are some differences across U.S. states in terms of their arrangements, in particular with respect to minimum wages or labor markets or corporate, well, or corporate taxation, but they tend to be rather small, or economic integration, or in cases where economic integration remains limited, as was the case under the GATT Bretton Woods regime, which I'll come to later on. So the implication of this is that when you ask the question, what kind of a state would hyperglobalization require, the answer is that you would need a state that actually does provide the public goods that markets require in terms of property rights and contract enforcement and monetary and financial stability. So it's not the case that hyperglobalization doesn't have any need for states. It does have the states because those institutional underpinnings still have to be provided by governance arrangements that do exist, and those are by and large the nation states. But the limits of what there are limits to what the states can do in terms of, in particular, that they cannot impose any cost on the free flow of goods and capital across borders, including maintaining non-harmonized regulatory regimes. And therefore, such states generically have to be willing to sacrifice all economic, social, and political objectives other than the elimination of transactions costs associated with jurisdictional boundaries. In effect, I would argue such states become instruments of the beneficiaries of hyperglobalization because they maintain they're responsive to their needs first and foremost, but they become very unresponsive to the needs of others. So here we come to sort of, we're harking back to the kind of populist rationale. And obviously this is going to be problematic for democratic regimes insofar as democratic deliberation and accountability may require divergent policies or institutional arrangements. In other words, a broader accountability and responsiveness to a broader range of interests and not just those that are served well by hyperglobalization. So let me clarify finally before I come specifically to the trilemma is that the tension between democracy and hyperglobalization that this argument leads to is a somewhat subtle argument, and it's not the argument you often hear, which is stated in the form that, well, since global rules or global markets constrain what the national governments can do, therefore, globalization must be in tension with democracy. That is not the argument I'm making, because I do believe in the principle of what political scientists call the principle of democratic delegation, that there are circumstances under which democracies can cede sovereignty or power to autonomous or independent agencies and thereby actually enhance the performance of democracy. So the problem is not that democracies necessarily undermine themselves by ceding authority to trade agreements or to Brussels or to global investment rules. The trouble, however, is that the principle that globalization or global rules can enhance democracy doesn't imply that it always does or will. And in particular, I would draw a significant distinction in principle and in substance between two types of approaches to globalization. One, which I've called the hyperglobalized or the hyperglobalist mindset, which justifies any and all external rules that restrict domestic policy space so as to minimize transactions costs associated with national borders, versus what one might call a democracy-enhancing globalization, which would impose only those and mostly procedural restrictions, such as transparency, accountability, representativeness, use of scientific evidence, and so forth, that enhance democratic deliberation, therefore are consistent with democracies. And I would argue that a lot of the problem with both the gold standard model of globalization, as well as today's model of globalization after the 1990s in particular, is that it's moved significantly in the direction of a kind of globalization which essentially serves the interests of some segments of society rather than broad interests of society. And therefore, it is not a democracy-enhancing globalization. It's the model of hyperglobalization that I've described before. Now, in the remaining 5 minutes, let me put all of this in the context of the trilemma and run through a very quick history of the world economy using the trilemma as a vehicle. So the trilemma basically says that of the following three things, hyperglobalization, national sovereignty, and mass politics, or democratic politics, interchangeably. They're not the same, but for my purposes, they're the same. Of those three things, you can have at most two at the same time. And therefore, you have to make a choice, and this is where the trade-off comes. You cannot have hyperglobalization, national sovereignty, and democratic politics all at once. You have to choose 2 out of 3. And you can, depending on which 2 out of the 3 you choose, you have a different model of the world economy, different constitution for states and politics and democracy. So historically, the gold standard was really a model where the choice was combining hyperglobalization with national sovereignty. National sovereignty was there because you needed national sovereigns, as I suggested before, to enforce contracts, to enforce property rights, and you also needed the sovereign powers at the center to enforce contracts also through the use of gunboats, if necessary, to enforce debt contracts in the periphery. That was the model of golden straitjacket, as actually Tom Friedman has called it, in terms of what you could do, however, in terms of domestic economic policy. That is that all domestic policy options were limited by the requirement of the gold standard, by fixed parity against the gold, and by the need to maintain complete openness to financial flows. And going back to the populists of the late 19th century, the conflict was precisely that the gold standard didn't enable the U.S. monetary authorities to inflate, to increase the money supply, because that was tied by the fixed currency to the gold. It was the same conflict that would actually eventually bring down the gold standard in the interwar period in 1931, when Britain ultimately, facing the same challenge that the United States was facing in the late 19th century, eventually chose to get off the gold standard to prevent unemployment and economic distress from increasing. In other words, chose monetary independence and monetary reflation rather than deflation through the gold standard. And the main difference, I think, between late 1890s or the rest of the world and the 1930s was a point that was something that John Maynard Keynes understood well and internalized in his own thinking about the design of the world economy after the Second World War. And the point was that in societies and economies where large parts of the population are now politically mobilized, where you have mass labor movements, where you have mass media, where you have a party of the left or a labor party representing labor, you cannot tie the economy to the mast of the global economy, that you need that policy space, you need that room for maneuver. And therefore, when we come to the 1944, to the Bretton Woods meeting, where John Maynard Keynes now is a key architect of the post-war monetary and financial system, he takes that lesson very clearly to the design of the post-war monetary and financial arrangements. And he says, we have to keep hyperglobalization at bay. We need to give sovereigns room to manage their economies. Of course, he was partly concerned with monetary and fiscal counter-cyclical policies, the policies that today we call Keynesian policies. And it was very clear that in order to do that, that you needed to have capital controls, because without capital controls, you would not be cutting domestic monetary and fiscal policies much of a slack. And it was clear that these capital controls had to be a permanent feature of this regime, not just a transitory one. And in fact, the world trade regime developed in a very similar path, although it came out of a somewhat different strand of negotiations where Keynes was not directly involved. But the trade regime also actually applied the same principle, which is that you needed to leave a lot of policy space for countries to develop their own regulatory approaches. Now, so very quickly, since I've run out of time, one could envisage a third way of resolving this trilemma, which is some kind of a global governance regime where we essentially significantly reduce the role of the national sovereign. We move democratic politics to the transnational level, rather than the national level. So that would be a perfectly consistent way of thinking about these. In some ways, that's perhaps for the Eurozone, is probably the best ultimate solution to their trilemma, which would be to some kind of fiscal political integration in the Eurozone in ways that we had started to talk about yesterday. So let me just conclude here. I think first point is that capitalism and the market economy is not a unique construct, that it's a malleable system, it changes over time, and it changes across space. And the current system of globalization, I would argue, rests on unstable foundations because it has not made a clear choice on this trilemma as to which of the two to pick. And I think fixing this is going to require a very conscious and deliberate choice in favor of one of the following three strategies. One is to deliberately enlarge the policy space for national governments. Second is to significantly strengthen, alternatively that is, significantly strengthen the scope and democratic accountability of global governance arrangements. Or third, probably the least desirable alternative, is to accept the dilution of democratic practices and principles. This is I think, a set of decisions that all countries are facing, but I would argue that it is it's most evident and most pressing in the Eurozone in particular, where the movement towards hyperglobalization has gone the furthest. Thank you.
Thank you.